The land down under has never been easier to reach. United Airlines has more flights between the U.S. and Australia than any other U.S. airline, so you can fly nonstop to destinations like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Explore dazzling cities, savor the very best of Aussie cuisine, and get up close and personal with the wildlife. Who doesn't want to hold a koala? Go to united.com/Australia to book your adventure.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, journalist Johann Hari discusses the successes and concerns surrounding new weight loss drugs, as well as his personal experience taking Ozempic. He's interviewed by Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller.
We need your help to reach our $25,000 summer fundraising goal. A generous donor will match every dollar you give, doubling your impact. I'm Rachel at C-SPAN, and your support keeps the unfiltered access you rely on and extends C-SPAN's reach through our podcasts. Donate now at cspan.org/donate and make twice the difference. Every amount helps. Thank you for listening and for your support. Your donation is now doubled at cspan.org/donate.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to talk about this book. This conversation about anti-obesity medications and Ozempic has been dominating the news in the US, and it's something that I cover every single day, and it's kept me quite busy. Like, there is just constant news about this. So I was really curious, when you were writing this book, how did that factor into the writing process? Because I can imagine that in the process of writing this book, there was news and things were changing constantly. And I know that you addressed the sort of questions that are still lingering out there. But, was it difficult to sort of render with the constant news flow about these drugs?
Yeah, I mean, that was a really big and fascinating challenge. It's like documenting a kind of explosion. 47% of Americans want to take these drugs, and we're learning more and more about them with every day that comes. And I think it kind of fed into this wider approach that I had, all these new developments, because I remember from the moment I learned about these drugs, I felt so divided about them. I don't remember any subject where I felt so conflicted so quickly when I learned about a topic. I remember exactly the moment when I learned about them. It was the winter of 2022, and it was that moment when the world was opening up again after everything we'd been through. And I got invited to a party. It was thrown by an Oscar-winning actor. I'm not saying that just to name drop. There is a relevance to this. And I was in the Uber on the way there, and I'd gained a lot of weight during lockdown, and I'd been quite fat at the start. And I was feeling a bit self-conscious. And then I suddenly remembered, loads of people I know gained weight during the pandemic. This is going to be fascinating. I'm going to go to this party and see loads of Hollywood people with a bit of chub on them, right? That'll be so interesting. And I arrived and I started walking around, and it was really weird. Not only had they not gained weight, everyone was skinny. Everyone was gaunt. Everyone was markedly thinner than they had been before. And I was kind of walking around a bit of a daze, and I bumped into a friend of mine by the dance floor, and I said to her, wow, looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during lockdown. And she laughed at me, and I didn't know why she was laughing. And she said, right, Johann, it's not Pilates, right? And I had no idea what she was talking about. And she pulled up on her phone an Ozempic pen. It was the first time I learned that we now have a new form of weight loss drug that causes the average person who uses it to lose 15% of their body weight. For the next in this class of drug, you actually get 24% loss of body weight on average. Staggering. It's going to be available next year, probably. And as soon as I learned it, I immediately thought, well, I can see the benefits here, right? I'm older now than my grandfather ever got to be, because he died of a heart attack when he was 44. Lots of the men in my family get heart disease. I knew that obesity makes it much more likely you'll get over 200 known diseases and complications. So I thought, well, if there's a drug that can actually reverse or hugely reduce obesity, that's going to have all sorts of advantages. But I also thought, wait a minute. I've seen this story before, right? There's about every 20 years a new weight loss drug is announced. We're told it's going to save the world. Huge numbers of people take it. We always end up discovering it has some kind of catastrophic side effect. It always gets pulled from the market, leaving a trail of devastated people in its wake. I was also worried about body positivity, the progress we've made with that, with eating disorders. So I felt super, super conflicted, which is why I went on the big journey to write the book all over the world, from Iceland to Minneapolis to Japan, to interview the leading experts on the drugs, the leading critics of the drugs. And all through that journey, like you say, we're getting all these new developments. We're learning more at every stage. So it was thrilling and daunting.
Yeah, and what was the experience like of, like you said, you've traveled all over the world, interviewed, the leading experts, the people that were there at the very beginning of the discovery of GLP-1, but this is also a very personal journey for you throughout the book, and your own friendships and your own experiences are weaved throughout the book. And what was that experience like? Because this is, an issue that is highly stigmatized. And, was that a scary or difficult experience to sort of bear your own soul and your own experiences in this book?
Yeah, there's so much emotion tied up with these topics, with food, with obesity, with the new anti-obesity drugs. And it's a very charged and febrile thing. So I was dealing with, I thought if I'm going to write about these drugs, I've got to take them. So I was taking Ozempic, and there was just the actual physical and psychological effects of taking Ozempic were pretty big. Then there's interviewing all the experts, realizing, oh, this is actually an experiment on millions of people and I'm one of the guinea pigs. And then there's the kind of effects on the culture that are playing out. I mean, just to start with the first one, with just the physical effects, it was the weirdest feeling. I'll never forget the second day I was on Ozempic. I woke up and I was lying in bed and I thought, oh, I feel something strange. What is it? And I couldn't locate in my body what it was that felt strange. And then I suddenly realized I had woken up and I wasn't hungry. I don't remember that ever happening before in my life. I used to get woken up often with a kind of raging hunger. And I went to this diner just up the street from where I live. And I ordered what I used to order every morning for breakfast, I'm slightly embarrassed to say, which was a huge brown roll with loads of chicken and loads of mayo in it. And I used to eat the whole thing and still be hungry. And on that morning, I had like 3 or 4 mouthfuls, and I was full. I didn't want any more. In fact, when I left the diner, the woman who runs it, Tatiana, the Brazilian woman, shouted after me, "Hey, are you okay?" Because she was so puzzled that I'd left my food. And it really was like the kind of shutters had come down on my appetite, right? I was 80% less hungry than I had been before. I was full really fast. I later learned, of course, the science of why that was happening to me. But just, it was such a dramatic effect. And I lost so much weight so quickly. I lost 42 pounds in a year. So I was sort of dealing with the physical transformation and the transformation in my habits, as well as absorbing, using my training in the sciences at Cambridge University to really absorb the science around this and do a deep dive into it. It was head spinning in a positive way, in a negative way. There were real incredible high points, incredible low points, and real intellectual excitement, actually. This is going to have such a huge effect on not just the people using the drugs, obviously, which is going to be, I would predict, half of Americans 10 years from now, provided some of the really catastrophic side effects that I'm worried about don't end up being worse than we think, but also just what it's going to do to how we think about these very deeply, as you say, very deeply charged issues.
And how did you figure out how to strike this balance of talking about the potential benefits and also the potential risks? And what are some of those risks?
I think, actually, if you just look at the facts, people should be very wary of people whose response to these drugs, after looking at it in detail, is either, yay, they're going to save us all, or boo, they're the devil. The truth is, this is really complicated, and anyone who's in a position like I was obese. Realistically, I was going to continue being obese. I had tried dieting 1,000 times. I usually ended up fatter than I was at the start. That's not true of everyone who tries diets. If you never tried a diet, try it first. But most people, 90% of people who go on diets, it doesn't work. So realistically, I was going to continue being obese. So really, I realised I was facing two choices. There was the risk of continuing to be obese with, sadly, all the health problems that that poses, or the risks of these drugs, right? And I think there isn't a kind of magic calculator that can tell you that. I think you have to go down the risks of obesity that I lay out in Magic Pill and the 12 big risks of these drugs and really look at them in relation to yourself. I guess the place to start, though, is with I think before we get to the risks, which I'm very concerned about, actually I think it's to start with the benefits, because the benefits are really significant. And if you want to think about both the benefits and the risks of these drugs, I think it might help to look at a parallel area of science. People have only been taking these drugs to treat obesity for a couple of years. Obviously, for diabetes, they've been taking them much longer. So it actually helps to look at a different area, which is bariatric surgery. Up to now, it's been very hard to lose a lot of weight and keep it off over the long term. Some people can do it just through calorie restriction and exercise, most can't. So actually, one of the best analogies is with things like stomach stapling, gastric sleeves. And there's a few things we know about that for sure. This has been very well studied. First thing we know is that bariatric surgery is a horrible, grueling, nightmarish operation. 1 in 1,000 people die during the operation. It's no joke. But people go put themselves through that because of what happens next. If you reverse your obesity or massively reduce it through this surgery, the benefits to your health are staggering. In the 7 years that follow the surgery, you are 56% less likely to die of a heart attack. You are 60% less likely to die of cancer. You're 92% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes. In fact, it's so good for your health that you're 40% less likely to die at all in those 7 years. So this fits with much wider body of evidence. Obesity, sadly, should never be stigmatized, but is very bad for your health on average. Of course, there are exceptions, but on average. And reversing it massively improves health. And we're seeing that with these drugs, right? If you take these drugs and you started with a BMI higher than 27, you are 20% less likely to have a heart attack or stroke in the next couple of years, which is a subject very close to my heart, literally very close to my heart, right? So the benefits are very clear, but the risks are also very alarming. Some of them actually emerge from looking at bariatric surgery. So, as I say, there's 12 big risks, but there's a really interesting other effect to bariatric surgery, which isn't often talked about. If you have bariatric surgery, in the aftermath, your risk of committing suicide almost quadruples. And your risk of depression is really quite significant. 17% of people who have bariatric surgery need inpatient psychiatric care in the aftermath. And you think that seems really weird, right? What's going on here? Why would that be? I think there's lots of reasons. But one, which is very relevant to these drugs, we know a significant minority of people who use these drugs seem to be becoming depressed, or there's even concerns that some people may become suicidal. You think, well, why would that be? There's a debate about, are the drugs affecting your brain? We know these drugs primarily work not on your gut, but your brain. I think there is something going on there. But actually, my own experience kind of helped me to think about this. I actually think what's happening for a lot of people, and there's good evidence for this, is one of the things these drugs do is they radically interrupt your eating patterns. You can't eat like you did before. And I had a real epiphany about this. I was in Las Vegas. I'm writing a book about a series of crimes that have been happening in Vegas I've been working on for a long time. So I spend a lot of time there. And I was researching the murder of someone that I knew and really loved, who was an amazing person. So it was a very painful, as you can imagine, very painful thing to be working on. And really on autopilot, this was 7 months into taking the drugs. On autopilot, I went to a branch of KFC. It's the one on West Sahara for the people in Vegas. It's one of the grimmest KFCs in the world. And I went in, and I ordered, just instinctively to make myself feel better, I ordered what I would have ordered a year before, a bucket of fried chicken. And I had it in front of me, and I had a chicken drumstick. And then I looked down at the food, and I thought, oh, I can't eat this, right? Like, on Ozempic, you can't overeat, you would throw up, right? You can't comfort eat in the way that you did before. And I remember very clearly thinking, oh, I'm just going to have to feel bad, right? I go through in the book the 5 psychological drivers of overeating, and a lot of them, for me, it was comfort eating. I realised that since I was a small child, I'd been using food to kind of numb my emotions, calm myself down. And when I couldn't do that, in the long term, that was a good thing. It brought those feelings to the surface. I've tried to find better ways to deal with them. But it was a difficult transition. It was painful. I felt it was hurtful. It was difficult. And I think that happens with bariatric surgery. I think that happens here. It's one of the many kind of unexpected effects that are emerging of these drugs.
Yeah, and I mean, we're learning about so many other unexpected effects. And you know, what were the scientific surprises that you discovered, or the really interesting things that you discovered scientifically about these drugs while delving into some of the research and the scientists that have spent decades and dedicated their career to, you know, bringing these drugs to life?
There's so many surprises. It's a great question. I think a lot of them relate to the 12 big risks associated with these drugs that I go through in the book. So, for example, one of them is if you're asking experts about safety in relation to these drugs, generally what they'll say, and it's an important point and they're good scientists, is actually we know quite a lot about the short and medium term effects of these drugs, because diabetics have been taking these drugs now for 18 years, right? For people who don't know, in addition to having these effects on your appetite, these drugs also stimulate the creation of insulin, which is what diabetics, both type 1 and type 2 diabetics, need. So diabetics have been taking them for a long time. And what the experts say is, well, if the drugs had some catastrophic short or medium-term effect, beyond the well-known side effects like nausea, we would know by now. To put it more crudely than they would, you know, if the drugs made you grow horns, the diabetics would have grown horns by now. And that's an important point, and it should give us some reassurance. But some other scientists said, well, wait a minute, if we're going to base a lot of our confidence on the safety of these drugs when they've been used by diabetics, let's dig a bit more deeply into the diabetics. Let's see what's going on there. So, for example, there's a brilliant expert in France, Professor Jean-Luc Fahy, who's at the University Hospital in Montpellier, who was commissioned by the French Medicines Agency to look into the safety of these drugs for the French market. And so he started looking at what's called the preclinical literature, the research on animals first. And he noticed something really disturbing, which is that these drugs, when they're given to rats, the active component, when it's given to rats, it makes them much more likely to develop thyroid cancer. And we know these drugs work by changing, by simulating a hormone called GLP-1 that I'm sure we'll talk about more. And we know that you have receptors for GLP-1 not just in your gut and in your brain, but in your thyroid. So it kind of makes sense. So if you're screwing with GLP-1, it might screw with the thyroid. So what he did is he looked at the database, he did a big analysis of the databases in France, and he compared diabetics who'd been using these drugs between, I think it was 2006 and 2012, to diabetics who had not been using these drugs but were otherwise similar. And what he calculated, this is contested, but what he calculated is that these drugs make you 50 to 75% more likely to develop thyroid cancer. Now, it's important to understand what that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean if you take these drugs, you have a 50 to 75% chance of getting thyroid cancer. If that was the case, we would be having bonfires of Ozempic all over the world. What it means is, whatever your thyroid cancer risk was at the start, if he's right, the risk goes up by 50 to 75%. Now, thyroid cancer is relatively rare. 1.2% of people get it in their lives. Nonetheless, it's a big increase in that risk, right? Now, against that, and this is where you begin to see, again, the surprising complexity here. Against that, some other scientists said to me, well, even if he's right, you've got to compare that to the cancer risk just from being obese. You know, as Cancer Research UK, the biggest British cancer group, warns, when you carry excess weight in your body, that fat doesn't just sit there, right? It's not inert. It's active. It sends signals through your body. And one of the signals that it sends is for your cells to divide more rapidly, which of course can cause cancer. This is why, in fact, obesity is one of the biggest causes of cancer here in the United States. We don't think of it that way. You think, oh, my auntie died of breast cancer, but actually obesity may well be what killed your auntie, because the obesity may well have triggered the breast cancer. It's not the cause of all of it, but it's the cause of a lot of it. So again, you see at every stage, you've got to be weighing the complexity here. And I think people really need to go down the risks of obesity that I lay out in the book and the 12 risks associated with the drugs and see, well, which of these apply to me? Look, some of them don't apply to me, right? One risk I'm really worried about is pregnancy. We know that when you give the active component in these drugs to rats, they're much more likely to have fetuses with birth deformities, right? Pregnant women are told not to use these drugs, but of course, some people don't know they're going to get pregnant for all sorts of obvious reasons, right? I'm very worried about that risk. That doesn't apply to me, obviously, but that's something I'm very worried about. I'm very worried about eating disorders. We already had an epidemic of eating disorders in this country that disproportionately affects, obviously, mostly young girls. Eating disorders experts are really worried about what's happening when young girls are getting hold of these drugs and using them to starve themselves. There's a lot we can do to prevent that I can talk about. So there's a very broad range of risks alongside the significant benefits.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different questions that I have now out of what you just said, but I mean, this idea of, and I know that this is something you touch on in the book, the idea of weighing benefits versus risks and how that's sort of a different calculation for different populations. And here we're talking about people with obesity, you know, whose BMI is over 30 or whose BMI is over 27 and they already have comorbidities and they are eligible to take these drugs. And for them, the, you know, risk benefit calculation might be a little bit different, but we're also seeing a ton of off-label use here in the US and people who might not necessarily, you know, maybe shouldn't be taking these drugs are seeking them out. And, you know, what did you learn and what did you discover about this sort of like shifting culture around these drugs and off-label use in the US?
Yeah, the worst moment for me in working on the book was a moment, it was maybe 3 or 4 months into working on it. I was FaceTiming with my niece, my sister's daughter, and she's called Erin. And she's the baby of my family. She's the only girl in that generation, and she's the youngest, so no one makes me more protective. She's actually 19 now, but in my head, she's always fixed as a 6-year-old. And we were FaceTiming, and she was kind of making kind of complimentary jokes, like, you know, oh, I didn't know you had a jaw before, Johann. I didn't know you had a neck. And I was sort of preening and laughing. And then she looked down and she said, will you get me some Ozempic? And I thought she was kidding because she's perfectly healthy weight and always has been. And I suddenly realised she wasn't. And I thought, what am I doing? I'm undermining every lesson I've ever given her in her life. You know, about valuing herself, about not judging herself this way. I thought I've fed into this. I think you phrased it really well in the question. I think there's a big distinction between people who are obese or overweight who are taking these drugs to go down to a healthy weight. There's still significant risks associated with that. But I think that is a wholly defensible decision. And I interviewed lots of people who've made that decision and have seen their health improve in the short to medium term. But there's another group of people who are already a healthy weight or indeed skinny. Think about the people at that party that I went to that I mentioned at the start. None of them were overweight, right, at the start. Who are taking it to be super skinny. Now, I don't judge anyone in that position. They're overwhelmingly women. I don't want to, it feels ridiculous to mansplain this to you. You know this much better than I do. But there's nothing women can do in this culture with their bodies that won't get them insulted and pressurized. And women are under staggering amounts of pressure on that. And I'm not judging anyone in this situation. What I would say, though, is what we do know is that if you're already a healthy weight or skinny and you take these drugs to be even skinnier, A, you could be triggering more people like my niece to get into that spiral, but B, and more importantly, you're actually endangering your own health. So one of the things we know about these drugs, firstly, you're incurring all the 12 risks that I write about in the book with none of the health benefits, right? So in the cost-benefit analysis, it's all risk, no benefit. But in addition, you're taking on another risk to your health. So as you age, you naturally lose muscle mass, which is the total amount of soft tissue in your body. It's really important for things like, you know, getting out of a chair, climbing the stairs, very important. And what these drugs do, so you naturally lose that depressingly from when you're 30 years onwards, you lose muscle mass every year. And that's obviously, you know, natural process. But when you take these drugs, or indeed when you lose weight in any way, bariatric surgery, when you lose a huge amount of weight, generally you lose a lot of muscle mass as well. You don't just shed fat, you shed muscle mass. So what those people who are skinny, who are taking the drug to be super skinny, are risking is that they will go into the aging process with very low levels of muscle mass. So as they lose it more and more as they age, they're really at risk of it won't show up much now, they won't have big problems now, but when they're 60, 70, they're at risk of, if you have very low muscle mass when you're old, that's nightmarish. You can get a condition called sarcopenia, which means poverty of the flesh, where you just basically can't do much. You can't climb the stairs, you can't get out of a chair. If you fall over, you're much more likely to die. So the risk is that all these skinny people take it to be super thin, that we're setting in train a kind of time bomb that doesn't show up now particularly, but further down the line we'll have a lot more people who are incapacitated in old age.
Yeah, and I mean, what did you tell your niece in this situation, and like what, from talking to eating disorder experts, and what did you learn from them about how we can help prevent this from worsening eating disorders and contributing to issues that are already so prevalent in our society?
Yeah, I felt very ashamed when I spoke to my niece, and I tried to talk to her about how, a bit like what we were just saying, how I had done it, because, a lot of the men in our family get heart disease, and I was worried about that. But it's very difficult because the truth is you can't separate out the health benefits from the fact that you get more in line with like the society's idea of what it means to be hot, right? And I can't deny that I got pleasure from that. Like, a few months into taking the drug, my neighbour's hot gardener hit on me. There were loads of benefits to that, right? So it's difficult that, because she could see, I've got to be honest, I wasn't just enjoying the health benefits. I can sit here and go, it was a purely health thing. And health was a really big factor for me. But I was also enjoying that, and she could see that. And she's a very intelligent young woman. There was no point lying to her about that. So I had to have this very difficult kind of conversation with her. But I think you've gone to exactly the right point, which is, with this effect with eating disorders, which I was warned about by lots of experts. Think about someone called Dr. Kimberly Dennis, brilliant. She's the CEO of SunCloud Health in Chicago, one of the leading eating disorders experts in the United States. And Dr. Dennis said, there's steps we could take urgently to reduce this risk. So at the moment, anyone watching, pretty much anyone, you could just go on Zoom, get an appointment today, if you've got the money, get an appointment with a doctor. The doctor looks at you on Zoom. They're meant to check your BMI. Well, good luck with that on virtually. Sorry, I got a weird distortion in my earpiece then, sorry. Yeah, they're meant to check your BMI. I mean, good luck with that, doing that virtually. And in practice, you could be effectively any BMI and you would get it, you do that, you pay the money and you get it delivered by courier the next day, right? Now, what Dr. Dennis argues, I think, unanswerably, is that these drugs should only be prescribed through inpatient, in-person meetings with the doctor, never on Zoom. And the doctors should be trained, it should be doctors who are trained to detect eating disorders and to divert people with eating disorders into treatment for their eating disorders, not starving themselves. My biggest worry about these drugs, I've got lots of worries about the drug that I go through and some worries for myself about the long-term effects of these drugs, but in the worst case scenario, anyone who's known anyone with eating disorders knows that there's a conflict within them between the part of them that's trying to starve themselves, that's driven by these psychological factors, which are obviously very complicated, and the biological part of them that just wants to live and stay alive. Right? And what these drugs do is they give you a tool to amputate your appetite and empower that psychological part over the biological part. So in my worst nightmare about this, we get an opioid-like death toll of young girls who would have survived their eating disorders but now get hold of these drugs and die. So I think we absolutely urgently need to make that reform. It doesn't take away from the people whose lives are saved by the drugs, and I met lots of people like that as well. People like, for example, a guy called Jeff Parker, who's a retired lighting engineer in San Francisco, lovely guy, 67, and he was very severely overweight. He was finding it painful to walk anywhere. He had gout, he had liver problems, kidney problems, heart problems. Every day he was swallowing fistfuls of pills and was quite unwell. And then his friend Mel gave him some Manjaro, one of these new drugs. He lost an enormous amount of weight. His doctor took him off almost all the pills. Now he walks his dog over the Golden Gate Bridge every day and said, I think I'm going to enjoy my retirement, right? So it doesn't take away from Jeff the legitimate use, although there's still these 12 risks that potentially apply to him, some of them. It doesn't take away from him that there's this eating disorders problem, but we've got to act on both, right? We've got to make it available to the people who need it for obesity if they want to take the other risks. And we absolutely need to do everything we can to keep it out of the hands of people with eating disorders.
And what do because I know that you talk to the companies, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, that make these drugs. And, what was their response to you raising these risks, asking about these risks? What do they have to say about all of this?
Yeah, I want to stress, I think there's plenty of drug companies I'm critical of. I actually think both Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are pretty responsible companies. They're reputable companies. I have issues with all drug companies because of the way we structure these things and the nature of lobbying. But as far as it goes, I think they're pretty responsible. And they've done a good thing, right? These drugs would not exist were it not for Novo Nordisk. So they do deserve some genuine credit. They stayed with these drugs for a long way down the line. And they deserve some real credit here. I don't think they're behaving irresponsibly. It's not their fault that some people use it off-label. I was surprised that Eli Lilly declined to comment on any of the 12 risks that I put to them. I genuinely don't know what to make of that. Novo Nordisk did go through engaging with the risks. I mean, as you would expect, that I think they underplay some of the problems. Underplay may be too strong a word. They emphasise the positive, the good news, and downplay the potentially bad news. And there's some things that you put to them that they literally can't answer. So my biggest worry about these drugs, for myself, is something very simple, which is we have absolutely no idea about the long-term effects of these drugs. Literally nothing. No one's been taking them for more than 18 years. It'll be 19 years pretty soon. And there's a kind of, and we know these drugs primarily affect your brain, right? Initially, it was thought they work on your gut. There is an effect on your gut, but actually they mainly work by changing your brain. And I interviewed a lot of neuroscientists about what is it doing to our brain. I go through the different theories about this. But, and the concern, of course, is like your brain. That's a pretty intimate part of who you are and who I am, right? It's absolutely core to ourselves. And there was a doctor who raised a concern with me, a brilliant research scientist called Dr. Greg Stanwood, who's at Florida State University. He stressed to me he's broadly optimistic about these drugs, but as a responsible scientist, he does have to raise some concerns. And one of them is, he gave an analogy. Now, I want to be clear, he's not suggesting these weight loss drugs will have this specific effect, but when you hear the analogy, you'll understand where he's coming from. If you go back to the 1950s, late 1950s, doctors started prescribing antipsychotics to people, because they judged at the time, controversially, but they judged at the time that the benefits outweigh the risks, right? And so for 40 years, you have lots of people taking antipsychotics. It was only literally 40, 50 years down the line that it was discovered, if you take these drugs for a long time, decade after decade, you are way more likely to get Alzheimer's disease, dementia, all forms of dementia. Now, it's not that the drug companies or the psychiatrists, indeed, were being remiss in the 1950s, right? There's just no way you could have known that you had to have people using it for a really long time. I think of this, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, these are unknown unknowns, right? We can't know. So I could put that to Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. What can they say? We don't know, right? They can say we monitor the safety very carefully and they're telling the truth. But so I think there's a huge amount of indeterminacy around these drugs. Although Dr. Shauna Levy, who's a brilliant obesity specialist at Tulane University School of Medicine, said to me, we don't know the long-term risks of these drugs. We do know the long-term risks of obesity. And the long-term risks of the drugs would have to be staggering to outweigh the risks of obesity. Now, that question only becomes more acute when you think about the issues relating to children, right? I interviewed parents who are facing the agonising decision. They've got very obese children. They've not been able to reverse their child's obesity. Their child is unwell. We know that obese children find it really hard to ever become unobese. And we know that if you're obese at the age of 18, you have a 70% chance of becoming diabetic, which knocks 15 years off your life on average. So these parents have this nightmarish decision. But if they choose to put their child on the drug, that, because the drugs only work for as long as you take them, that's a decision you're effectively choosing for your child to use a drug for like 80 years, right? Long-term effects? No idea. That is very sobering.
Yeah, and one of those decisions too, we're talking about whoever is taking these drugs, usually they will have to be on them for the rest of their lives because of this weight regain issue, when people go off and stop taking the drugs. And cost is something that really comes into consideration, especially when you're thinking about taking a drug for the rest of your life. And these drugs are not cheap in the US. They cost over $1,000, at least Wegovy and Zepbound and Mounjaro do. I think Ozempic's a little bit cheaper. You know, in writing this book and interviewing people for this book, what were the concerns about cost? You know, this has been a big conversation in the US recently, and people are saying the drugs are not affordable. It could hinder your access. You know, is this something you're concerned about? And what were the experts that you spoke with saying about the price of these drugs?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I know you've done really important reporting on this as well. I guess we're in this kind of, the danger is that the situation we're in now kind of continues, which is basically a situation where the Real Housewives of New Jersey get these drugs to be super skinny, while the real school children of New Jersey get to be diabetic at the age of 12, right? I'm slightly overstating it, but you get my point. The danger is that these drugs remain confined to a tiny elite of rich people. So the first thing to point out is these drugs do not cost very much to make. It's about $40 a month to make these drugs. One of the great scandals of this country, and again, I know you know this from your reporting much better than I do, is how much more Americans pay for drugs just across the board, right? I live between Britain and the US. You know, when I buy the drugs in Britain, they're about $200 a month. When I buy them in Vegas, they're about $1,200 a month. It is outrageous that Americans tolerate this. This is your political system allowing companies to rip you off and bilk you every day. So this is going to be a big issue for the next 8 years. In 8 years' time, Ozempic goes out of patent, at which point it will be a daily pill, it will cost $1 a day, and my prediction is that half the country will be taking it, right? But in those 8 years between now and then, we've got a real problem here, right? And I think there's lots of ways in which the drug prices could come down between now and then. I'm conscious you know much more about this than I do, so I feel silly saying it to you. But so one thing is the drug companies could compete on price. They could try to get more of a mass market. Another thing is, as Senator Bernie Sanders is arguing, we could finally regulate the drug companies to stop them ripping people off. I know, crazy notion there. There's all sorts of things we could do before we get to that point where the patent passes and it'll be, you know, available to everyone. And it's a window in which Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly argue, look, we developed these drugs, we should make some money in that period, we should benefit. I agree with them, but I would argue they don't need to make quite as much as they currently do. We could regulate them. You know, at the moment, Novo Nordisk is now the most profitable company in the whole of Europe. So I think we should be, you know, prioritising getting the drugs to people who need them, not least because by many measures, obesity is the biggest killer in this country. Professor Gerald Mand at Harvard, who designed the food label that's on all food in the United States, sold in the US, explained to me, presented me with his calculations, that obesity and food-related illnesses kill 678,000 Americans every year. That's more than all the American soldiers who died in all the wars of the 20th century, right? And indeed the war since, in this century. I mean, that is a staggering death toll. That's, you know, not far off having COVID every year, the COVID pandemic every year, right? That's staggering. We shouldn't accept this. We need to deal with the underlying factors that cause obesity. I write about what they are in the book, and I went to countries that have done that. Countries like Japan, where there is almost no obesity and literally almost no childhood obesity at all. We've got to learn from them, but in the meantime, we've got to use the best tools we have.
And what are some of those tools? I mean, you know, what are the things that you learned from Japan and from visiting some of these other places where the obesity rates are not quite as high?
Start in answering this question, which is, I think, one of the most important questions, with something really basic, right? I would just urge everyone, I was born in 1979, I would just urge everyone to just take out their phones. I would not normally recommend this while you're watching TV or listening to a podcast, and just Google photographs of beaches in the United States in the year I was born. Just take a look at them for a minute. When we look at them now with our eyes, they seem really strange because everyone is what we would call skinny or jacked. Everyone. You look at them and you're like, this is weird. Where's everyone else, right? Was it a skinny person convention on the beach the day that photo was taken? Then you look at the population figures. Obesity was really rare when I was born, right? So you basically have 300,000 years where you've got human beings and obesity is really rare. And then in my lifetime, it explodes. Between the year I was born and the year I turned 21, it more than doubled. And then in the next 20 years, severe obesity more than doubled again. So we've gone from there being almost no obesity in the early 20th century to 42.5% of Americans being obese today. What happened, right? The core to understanding that question is also core to understanding how the drugs work. And it comes down to a word we don't use that often in everyday English, but it's a word we know. It's satiety. Satiety is the feeling of being sated, the feeling of having had enough and not wanting any more. And it turns out this explosion in obesity that's happened here happens in every country that makes one change. It's not where people become weak-willed or lazy or all the stigmatizing things we say about this. It's where people move from eating a diet that mostly consists of fresh whole foods that are prepared on the day they're consumed, to people move to eating a diet that mostly consists of processed and ultra-processed food that is constructed out of chemicals in factories in a process that isn't actually even called cooking. It's called manufacturing food. And it turns out this new kind of food that never existed before affects our bodies completely differently to the old kind of food. And there's an experiment that really helped me to understand this. It was done here in New York. I nickname it Cheesecake Park in the book. It's not the official name. It's done by a brilliant Irish-American scientist called Professor Paul Kenny. So, who's the head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai, just up the road from where I am now. And it's very simple. He got a cage and he raised a load of rats. And all they had to eat was kind of healthy foods in pellet form that were the kind of foods that rats evolved to eat over thousands of years, right? And it turned out when they had this food, rats would eat when they were hungry and then just stop, right? They never became fat. They never overate. They had some kind of natural nutritional wisdom that meant they were like, oh, guys, I've had enough now, right? Then Professor Kenny introduced the rats in Cheesecake Park to the American diet. He fried up some bacon, he got a load of Snickers bars, he bought a load of cheesecake, and he put it in the cage alongside the healthy food. And the rats went crazy for the American diet. They would literally dive into the cheesecake and eat their way out and emerge just totally slicked with cheesecake. And they ate and ate and ate and ate. As Professor Kenny put it to me, within a couple of days they were different animals. That nutritional wisdom that they had when they had the natural food they'd evolved to eat vanished, and they all became obese and actually had all sorts of poor indicators for their health. Then Professor Kenny tweaked the experiment again in a way that feels a bit cruel to me as a former KFC addict. He took away all the American food and left them with nothing but the healthy food they'd grown up with. And he was sure he knew what would happen. They would eat more of the healthy food than they had in the past, and this would prove that processed and ultra-processed food expanded the number of calories you ate in a day. That is not what happened. Something much weirder happened. Once they'd had the American diet and it was taken away, the rats refused to eat the healthy food at all. It was like they no longer recognized it as food. It was only when they were literally starving that they went back to it. Now, there's a lot of evidence that human beings are in a similar situation. We all live in Cheesecake Park now. We're eating food that profoundly undermines our ability to ever feel sated, to ever feel full. And what these drugs do is they give us back our sense of satiety, right? If you ate something now, your pancreas would produce a hormone called GLP-1. And GLP-1 is basically just your body's natural signal going, hey, you've had enough, stop eating, right? It's the brakes, basically. But natural GLP-1 only sticks around in your system for a few minutes and then it's washed away. So what these drugs do is they inject you with an artificial copy of GLP-1 that goes to your gut and your brain, where you also have GLP-1 receptors, that sticks around in your system, not for a few minutes like natural GLP-1, but for a whole week, which is why when I went into that diner, I suddenly felt full, right? It's why you suddenly feel sated, because you've got artificially boosted levels of this copy of GLP-1. So you can see processed food undermined our satiety. These drugs give us back our satiety, but with a cost. And as Professor Michael Lowe in Philly said to me, these drugs are an artificial solution to an artificial problem, right? In Japan, They never allowed processed food to screw up their children. They never allowed it to dominate their kids' diets. I went to Japan to see how they achieved this. It's incredible. It's a really weird feeling to walk around a normal school of 1,000 children and realize there is not one overweight child in that school. They didn't allow processed food to screw them up. They didn't allow obesity to get a hold. And as a result, you can get Ozempic in Japan, but there's no market for it because there's almost no fat people, right? So you see this, what has been done to us. At the moment, people like me who are obese are in a trap, right? So we've got to make this painful choice. Do you want to continue with this risky medical condition, obesity, or do you want to take this risky drug? But that is not an inevitable choice. We do not have to tolerate that being the choice for our children and our grandchildren. If we fix the environment, like they did in Japan, we can save them from having to make that choice. And I know that sounds a bit pie in the sky, but think about smoking. I think we're probably about the same age. When we were kids, I mean, if you could take a contemporary American child back in time, they would be stunned. People smoked everywhere. People smoked on the subway. People smoked on the bus. People smoked on game shows. There's a photo of me and my mother where she's breastfeeding me smoking and resting the ashtray on my stomach, right? When I found this photo a few years ago, I thought she'd feel guilty. She looked at it and said, "You were a difficult baby. I needed that cigarette," right? That was normal then, right? Now, you know, you would be amazed if you saw a breastfeeding mother smoking, or you saw someone smoke on the subway. You'd call the cops if you saw someone smoking on the subway, right? We've gone from more than half the population smoking to about, I think it's 11% now, right? That was because we really worked at it. We changed the culture. We can do the same around food. We've got to take on these big vested interests like we had to take on the tobacco companies. But we can do that, and that will get us out of that trap. Japan did it, and as a result, they have the healthiest population in the whole world and the longest living population in the whole world. We deserve that too.
And so, I mean, what comes next? Like, everyone that I've talked to is like, even though these anti-obesity drugs are absolutely dominating the headlines and just there's so much out there about them right now, like, we're really still at the beginning of all of this. And so, you know, what comes next after this? What are you worried about? What are you excited about? What should people be watching out for going forward? You know, what are your sort of predictions for what's next in this world of anti-obesity medications?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Barclays Bank commissioned a very sober-minded financial analyst called Emily Field to go away and look at these drugs to figure out, you know, how it should guide their investment decisions going forward. And she came back and said, if you want a comparison for the effect this is going to have on the economy and the society, you've got to look at the invention of the smartphone, right? Which sounds very sobering. This is me talking now, but you know, if you imagine, if you know, obesity is the biggest killer, half the population almost wants to pay to take these drugs, and that's now before they've even seen the effects on everyone else. And so I think this is going to be huge. If we had been talking on the day that Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone, in what was it, 2007, I don't think we would have been able to game out, you know, TikTok and DoorDash and Uber and all these things that have profoundly transformed the way we live. I do think we're beginning to see glimpses of it. And I end the book by talking about lots of potential scenarios for what might happen now. And they range from, it's disconcerting, having done all the research I've done and having thought as deeply about this topic as I have, that such a broad range of scenarios is still possible. So the most pessimistic scenario, which I don't think is likely, but I don't think we can rule out, is that this is like a diet drug in the 90s called fen-phen. So fen-phen was a combination of an appetite suppressant called flexfluoramine and an amphetamine called phentermine. And this has kind of been written out of history now, but it was the most popular diet drug ever. By 1995, there were 18 million fen-phen prescriptions in this country. In that single year, the front page of Time magazine was the new miracle weight loss drug. It was talked about in exactly the way we're talking about Ozempic now. And then just a group of ordinary doctors in Fargo, North Dakota, noticed that a lot of the patients taking it were also having troubles breathing. And they raised an alert, which eventually led to the discovery that this drug caused primary pulmonary hypertension, a horrific condition where the blood vessels in your lungs contract and you can't breathe. If you're not on oxygen, you literally die. It killed an enormous number of people. It led to the biggest payout in the history of the pharmaceutical industry up to that point, $12 billion. It's not impossible that these drugs will turn out to be like that. It's not likely, but you can't rule it out, right? There could be some medium-term effect that is catastrophic, and I did speak to scientists who think that is a plausible but not likely risk. That's the most pessimistic. The most optimistic is the drugs work in the long term, the benefits outweigh the risks, we get them for everyone who wants to take them, they become affordable, and we wake up and say, how did we get to this point? How do we change the society so we don't have to drug ourselves en masse? That, I think, that's the scenario I most want to happen. But there's a really kind of broad range and a huge number of things for us to look out for. The reason I wrote my book, Magic Pill, is because I really think we need to take a beat to think deeply about this. And it's funny because I was thinking about this as you were asking your question. The book is called Magic Pill because there's 3 ways these drugs could be magic. The first way is the most obvious. They could just solve the problem, right? And I've got to tell you, there are days when it feels like that. My whole life, I've overeaten, I've been addicted to junk food. Now I inject myself once a week in the leg. I've gone from eating 3,200 calories a day to 1,800 calories a day. It feels like magic. The second way it could be magic is much more disturbing. It could be like a magic trick. It could be like the conjurer who shows you a great card trick while he's picking your pocket. It could be these drugs, that implies negative intent to the drug companies, which I don't mean, but it could be that it causes you so much harm in the longer term that it outweighs the benefits. I don't rule that out. But the third way in which it could be magic is actually the one I think is most likely and that is the key to answering your question. Think about the stories about magic that we grew up with as kids. Think about, what would be a good example, Aladdin, right? In those stories, you find the lamp, you rub it, the genie appears, he grants your wish, and your wish comes true. But it never quite comes true in the way that you expected, right? You get your wish, but at a weird right angle. We're already seeing that in so many ways with these drugs. So many strange and unpredictable effects. Who would have thought that Krispy Kreme stock would be down, right? Jefferies Financial just did a report for the airlines saying they're going to have to spend a lot less money on jet fuel soon because it's going to take so much less jet fuel to fly a thinner population. There's companies that manufacture the hinges for knee and hip replacements. Their stock is down because the biggest driver of knee and hip problems is obesity, and there's going to be a lot less obesity really soon. Even think about something as basic as jewelers in LA about a big run on them because people's fingers are shrinking so much that their wedding rings don't fit them anymore. They've got to be refitted, right? This is going to have crazy unpredictable effects for good, for sure, for bad, for sure. We need to think about this. If you're an individual thinking about it, there's a lot you've got to be prepared for psychologically that I hope I explain in the book. I would really recommend, if you're thinking of it, go down the list of the risks of obesity, go down the 12 big risks that I write about in Magic Pill. Think about which ones apply for you. There's no magic answer. Ultimately, it's a judgment call that no one can make for you. But I also think we need to think about what it's going to do to all of us, right? The stakes here are so high. So many people will live or die based on whether we get this right. It's really important we think about it and don't mindlessly make this shift.
And obviously everyone should go and read this book themselves.
Oh, thanks.
What are you hoping that people take away from, or, what is the lesson that you hope people walk away from this book with when there's so much information out there right now on these drugs? They're being discussed so much, like we've said. What is the takeaway that you're hoping and the contribution that this book is going to make?
There's so many, but it's funny, it's kind of hard to say this point, but I felt like such a failure for being fat and for failing at dieting. And I felt so embarrassed about it. And looking back now, if I could speak to my former self, I'd say you weren't a failure, you were an entirely typical product of your times. If you understand the difference between that beach in 1979 and us now is not that people became moral failures, it's that the environment screwed with us in profound ways and left us with this difficult choice, put us in this trap where these drugs are the only trapdoor we're being offered, and they are a risky and rusty trapdoor. and many people won't want to pull the lever to go down it, and they may well turn out to be right. But I guess the main thing I want to say is, when you can begin to see this problem in a different light, I think these drugs throw everything up in the air. If you really think deeply about these drugs, you have to think deeply about the whole question of obesity. And it throws so many things up in the air about it. It shakes up the old stories. It draws out these deep ideas we have that obese people are sinners, that if you're taking these drugs, you're cheating. I understand where those ideas came from because I felt them towards myself, I thought them. But I hope we can begin to tell a more complex and more truthful story about how we got here and how we can find our way out, that will lead to less blame and anger. You know, it's a culture where pretty much every argument turns toxic very quickly. But I really think this is an argument that's a topic which has been so laden with, strewn with landmines of shame and toxicity. I really think now we can begin to diffuse a lot of them. Everyone watching, a year from now, you will know someone who's lost a lot of weight taking these drugs, right? And that in itself is going to shake up the conversation in really fascinating ways. So I hope the book prepares us a bit for that conversation and how to think about it and how to have the conversations we're about to have in a way that isn't toxic and doesn't just rake up more blaming and anger, but actually brings us towards more love and compassion.
Definitely. And I know that you mention, your own personal story and friends' stories, your friend Hannah in the book, and, she's in the beginning and the end. And how did your friendship with Hannah and her personal experience sort of inform this book and shape this book?
Hannah was one of the best people I knew. She was the funniest person I've ever met. She was a couple of years older than me, maybe I think 2 years older than me. And we met when I was 19, she was 21. And no one will ever make me laugh as much as she did. She was hilarious. And one of the things we would bond over is our love of junk food and terrible food. We had a running joke where we would go to like the skeeziest diner and we would eat the most awful food and we would like review it as if we were like food critics. And she was very overweight and she became sick with all the illnesses associated with obesity, not all of them, but a lot of them. She got very bad back pain and got addicted to opioids. Then she came off. Then she got cancer, which is made much more likely by obesity. Then she got COVID and was much sicker with it than she otherwise would have been. And then she had a heart attack and died. And everyone watching will know someone who should have had a long life and was denied it because of obesity and because we live in this environment that drives up obesity. And you might not think of it that way. I mean, one of the things that most shocked me from the research for the book, I'm embarrassed to say this, it was something I thought I'd known since I was a little kid. It was how shockingly bad for your health obesity is. Obesity should never be stigmatized. It's no one's fault, except the food companies and the people who screwed us over. But the scientific evidence, and I looked at it skeptically, is, think about diabetes, right? I guess I've known since I was a kid, if you're obese, you're more likely to be diabetic, right? Much more likely to become diabetic, to get type 2 diabetes. But I guess I thought, before I did the research for the book, okay, that's not good, but if you're diabetic, provided you've got health insurance and you get insulin, you're basically like everyone else. A type 2 diabetic plus insulin is like me or you. That's not true at all. From interviewing the experts on diabetes and doing a deep dive into the research, if you're diabetic, it knocks 15 years off your life on average. It is the biggest preventable cause of blindness in this country. More people have to have a limb or extremity amputated in the US because of diabetes than because they got shot. And you will have noticed a lot of us get shot, right? Diabetes is devastating. It makes your life much shorter and it makes it much more likely you'll have a terrible last few years of your life. In fact, the effect is so bad, one of the leading doctors in Britain who treats diabetics, Dr. Max Pemberton, said to me something that sounds really shocking when you first hear it until you look at the facts. He said, if you gave me a choice between becoming diabetic and becoming HIV positive, I would choose to become HIV positive, because you're HIV positive and you get treatment, you live as long as everyone else. That is not true of diabetics, and diabetes is just one of the causes. So I think about my friend Hannah. You know, we always had this promise to each other. We learned how old must we have been? Maybe when we were in our mid-20s. We learned one day that in Vegas there's a place called the Heart Attack Grill. Lots of people will know it. It's just off Fremont Street. It's a place where, it's a restaurant where at the entrance there are cattle scales, and if you weigh more than 350 pounds, you eat for free when you go in. All the waitresses are dressed as nurses. You have to sign a waiver saying if the food gives you a heart attack, it's on you. It's not their responsibility. If you don't finish the food, they kind of spank you with a paddle. So we had this running joke that one day we would go and we would toast our friendship in banana milkshake in the Heart Attack Grill. And after she died, not long after she died, I was in Vegas. And I thought, I'll go, I'll toast her. And I went and I looked at these scales and I looked at the people in there. And it was like this joke just turned to dust in my mouth. It was, or ashes in my mouth. It felt like the joke was on us. It was tough.
Yeah, and like you said, I'm sure so many people, especially in the US, have similar experiences, know people with obesity who have struggled with obesity and related conditions. And I think that that's why all of this is so relevant and these weight loss drugs are so relevant. And so I think we are just about out of time, but I am so appreciative of your time today. And it was so great to talk to you about this book. So thank you so much.
You asked great questions, and I admire your reporting for Bloomberg, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.